Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, welcome back to our webinar series exploring prescribed fire for forest management. Before we begin today, we acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies land of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. My name is Michelle Witeka, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I serve as the prescribed fire specialist for the Wisconsin DNR, and that means I administer the statewide DNR burn program. I've been in this position for over 7 years and have been a prescribed firebug for over 20 years in various parts of the country. I began my career restoring the globally rare longleaf pine forests in Florida, and I am very fulfilled in my current position, working to increase all manner of prescribed burning, but particularly in our fire-dependent oak and pine forests. One of the biggest benefits I have in this position is working with such fine partners as our speakers here today. Our invited speakers will explore several facets of prescribed fire related to forests and forest management. They have been invited to provide their perspective and offer advice on how we can advance prescribed fire as a forest management tool in the future. We don't expect our speakers or anyone to have definitive answers about what the future will look like. Rather, we hope this series will provide insights, pose questions, and stimulate our collective thinking. So today we will be hearing general information and specific case studies involving prescribed fire and interfering vegetation. And this is such a crucial topic right now because aside from lack of fire, this is one of the biggest factors that affects the regeneration of our fire-dependent tree species. And this comes at a time when we are asking even more of our forests, from production to recreation to preservation of important wildlife habitat, and now resilience in the face of climate change. So before I introduce our guests, we have a quick couple of housekeeping items to review. Session recordings, additional resources, evaluation links, and information about continuing education will all be available through the portal. As a reminder, you only need to register once for the entire series, so if you're joining us here today, you won't need to register again. We will do our best to ensure the recordings are posted within 2 weeks of today's session, and to receive continuing education, you must be registered through UWSP, and you must complete the Microsoft form provided for you during the session. This link will be posted periodically throughout the webinar and today in the chat feature. If you are watching a recorded session, you will need to record your attendance using a different link that will be provided in the portal. So if you have any questions, please email wfc@uwsp.edu. So it's critical that everyone attending the live sessions or watching the recordings is registered for the series. This helps us with securing funding to continue offering free educational opportunities. We kindly ask that you do not share the portal, Zoom link, or Zoom recording to someone not registered for the series. Thanks for your cooperation on there. This series is hosted by the Wisconsin Forestry Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Department of Forestry. An evaluation link will be provided later this morning, and we'll hope you'll provide feedback so we continue to improve our series. So although you're attending virtually, we still want to hear from you. So go ahead, please type any questions or comments into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Keep all questions in the Q&A. Please type any comments into the chat function of Zoom. The chat feature may not be monitored for questions, but our technical host is monitoring for content. And we'll do our best to answer all questions and comments, but we may be limited by time. So before we begin today, go ahead, please say hi and let us know where you're listening from in the chat. And last but not least, we sincerely appreciate our sponsors for making this opportunity free for all attendees. Today, we would like to highlight our series platinum sponsor, the National Wild Turkey Federation, and our series gold sponsors, the Ruffed Grouse Society and the American Woodcock Society and the Nature Conservancy. And at this point, I'll go ahead and introduce our first presenter, Jack McGowan-Stinski, who is the program manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium.
And actually a change up. Jim was going first, Michelle.
Oh, shoot, that's right. I'm reading an old script. Okay, I will switch. And it actually is Jim Ellison, who is the founder of Quercus Land Stewardship. I'm going to try and say that again. Quercus Land Stewardship Services, which is a great prescribed fire contracting service here in Wisconsin. Jim, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Get my screen up here and is that showing up okay?
You got it.
Okay, great. Um, as Michelle said, I founded Quercus Land Stewardship Services in 2003. It's an ecological contracting business that does prescribed burning as well as other restoration, land management activities. And I turned over ownership of the business in 2020, and now I'm a part-timer helping out here and there with the fire program, and gotten involved with the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council, which shameless plug for anyone who's interested in prescribed fire, should be a member of the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council. And so I'm going to share some of what I've learned today about managing oak woodlands with prescribed fire. When I'm going to have to see, there we go. So I'll talk a little bit about what is interfering vegetation. That's an interesting term, and then share some of my experience working with a lot of different landowners over the last couple decades. So what is interfering vegetation? When Mike Tiller invited me to do this presentation, I thought, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. That's different terminology. Sort of begs the question, interfering with what? Which then implies that you've got some kind of objective. So it makes us think about what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Is it promoting oak regeneration? Well, fire, I think, can be helpful for that objective. Maximizing timber yield. Well, on an individual tree basis, you might have a little loss in value from using fire on your oak woodlands. But overall, I think what we're doing is promoting the oak woodland for total and future timber value. Restoring native vegetation, definitely fire's a tool for achieving that objective. And I like to say that that fire is really promoting a stable, diverse, and sustainable vegetation community. The lack of fire on the landscape is really one of the causes of not having those factors in our community. We know that over the last 10,000 years, since the glaciers retreated, our vegetation communities have continually been changing. And we know that they've always been influenced by human activity. And we know they've always been influenced by fire, and generally fire as a part of that human activity. Really, in the last 100 years or so is when we've removed that influence of fire, and that's led to a lot of the challenges that we're facing with our land management in general and our oak woodlands in particular. And so what I've come to see is that regular use of low intensity fire can help improve the structure of our oak woodlands, definitely reduce the dominance of that brush layer, and improve diversity on the ground layer. For context, most of my experience has been in Wisconsin's driftless region. That's the section of the state and actually the section of the world that was never touched by the glaciers, characterized by very rugged topography, lots of variability in the landscape. But I think the concepts I'm talking about are going to be applicable also to oaks and to other ecosystems in other areas. And Jack's going to expand on that a little bit in his presentation. I've got three case study sites that where most of the pictures have come from that I'm going to show. And these sites have been managed with fire over the past 8 to 20 years. The burn units typically get burned every 1 to 5 years. And the burn treatment has been combined to some extent with mechanical and chemical treatment on each of the sites. Want to say a little bit about that. Conventional wisdom is that we can't accomplish everything we want to accomplish in terms of restoring our oak woodlands with fire alone. I think, I see some evidence that it may be possible, but we would have to be much more patient. We generally, most of us don't want to hang around for another 50 or 100 years and see the effects that we would get with a regular fire regime. So in our impatience, we're also doing some mechanical and chemical treatment to move that process along. Although, I've got some examples that show that that really we might not need to be doing as much mechanical removal and chemical treatment as we think we do. This area of the state in the surveyor's notes from the 1830s was mapped as primarily oak savanna with some prairie and other fire-dependent ecosystems kind of mixed in. And over the past 200 years, those oak savannas have pretty much all grown in, and the landscape has changed quite a bit, but oak is still a pretty prominent component of our forest today. The oak woodlands in southwest Wisconsin share some typical characteristics. Almost all the land is privately owned. The forests are existing in an agricultural matrix, and they're highly fragmented. Most of the woodlots are small. We're talking 10 to 50 acre sizes of woodlots. And almost everything is overgrown pasture, literally. There's a thick brush layer and mid-story, and the vegetation on the ground is thin to non-existent. So looking at going back 90 years or so, in the 1937 air photo, you can see here for scale, I've got a box drawn on that's 160 acres for scale reference, and we can see from 1937 to 2024 how the woods have closed in and expanded considerably. Another example here, again with the size reference, you can see that there's not a whole lot there for woods, and they're pretty thin and scattered. You still got a lot of that open savanna structure. And then in another 90 years, everything is quite closed in and also expanded in size. When we zoom in here to this 40-acre box, it's pretty clear how just about every square foot that they could was plowed for field crops, and anything that they couldn't plow was pastured with dairy cattle. So not a lot of forest resource existing there. And now, of course, that's all closed in, and the woods have expanded in size. So that's what we're working with in terms of where we came from with our oak woodlands. Here's a good example. This picture shows really what would have been more typical when that process was getting started 50 or 60 years ago, when farmers started feeding more alfalfa and doing less grazing, taking the cows out of the woods, and that brush starts filling in between the trees, and you get the early succession trees coming up in between the oaks. So this is kind of illustrates that process of what those woods went through. Historically, the area was covered with a patchwork of prairie, savanna, and woodland, with continual gradual transitions between those cover types. The definition that a lot of people use for oak woodland is a canopy cover between 30% and 80%. Under 30% would have been savanna or prairie, and there wasn't much of anything that was more than 80% canopy cover. And the mid-story was very open and with a very rich ground layer vegetation. And so, we've got a lot of patchiness, a lot of transition between open grassland and more of your open savanna structure, and then the little more closed in woodlands. See there a lot of diversity in the structure. Here we see some open grown savanna trees that 150 years ago, those would have been the only trees on that hillside, but over the years and the decades, we've filled in quite a bit and lost that savanna structure. And this is what we see today in our woods. Very heavy ground layer stretching up into the mid-story. In our area, it's primarily honeysuckle and buckthorn. And you see the abrupt transition here, looking along the line between the treated area and the untreated area. And here's another shot looking down the property line between the more typical contemporary oak woodland filled in with tall brush, and the open oak woodland structure that we're going to, and that we really can achieve by using fire on the landscape. Some more examples of that open structure. This one, there's still some mid-story there, but it's much more open, and a lot of that brush layer is gone. When we talk about fire in oak woodlands, what we're really most preferring is low intensity fire, definitely less than 4-foot flame length, typically more in the range of less than 1 foot to 2-foot flames. That low intensity fire creeps around through the litter on the ground. You get a longer residence time on the brush stems, and better fire effects. And as we get into the more open savanna-like areas, we get a little more ground layer vegetation on the ground, and then we get this flames up to 4 feet or more in that heavier ground layer vegetation. And this is what we're not going for. Actually, this photo was taken, this fire was intentionally used to try to remove the woody vegetation from this hillside, but I use this shot as an example of what you don't want if you're managing your oak woodlands with fire. We're trying to keep the fire intensity down. So here's an example of really what we're looking at. This is a fire in November getting into the afternoon, the fire has resolved itself into a single flanking fire moving slowly across the hillside. And then after that low intensity fire goes through, this is what you see. We can see that the fire here was hot enough to scorch those little buckthorn stems, but not really hot enough to burn off the leaves. So I'll show some examples of fire escape, fire effects, and what we can achieve with using fire on the ground. Here's this was some old growth honeysuckle that had not been burned in decades, if ever. And there were a lot of oak leaves on the ground, and this was a fall fire, actually fairly low intensity that went through there, but consumed those oak leaves and put a real good kill on the large honeysuckle. Of course, we see the resprouting from the roots, but now this vegetation, we've removed a lot of the interference from this particular area, and this resprouting honeysuckle isn't really interfering with a whole lot of anything. Here's an example showing how the low intensity fire acts on the clumps of buckthorn. You can see that the stems that had been top killed previously, some of them are burned off completely. You can see other stems there that had been alive that are charred and scorched pretty well. And what you also see here is the low intensity of the fire, that all of the litter isn't even consumed here. Some of those oak leaves have fallen since that fire occurred, but you can still see that there's quite a bit of litter remaining on the ground. This buckthorn, you can see the main central stem there that was top killed many fires ago, and you can see all the resprouting that occurred. And each year you're knocking that, taking some of the vigor out of that plant. And this one you can't really even see any resprouting at the base, so this one might be done for. This buckthorn, you can see the small buckthorn resprouting at the base of the top killed stems. But again, that buckthorn is just a component of your ground layer vegetation here, and it's not interfering with anything. Sometimes you get some of this, a clump or a small stand of brush that remains, continues to persist. I imagine the ground layer underneath this brush is still pretty poor, which you see under thick buckthorn, but the brush itself isn't up in the mid-story, and it's not casting that dense shade that you see with the older growth type buckthorn. And we know that eventually that patch is likely to end up like this one, where we finally get enough fuel underneath it and get a fire to go through there that's really going to get us on the way to removing that. Here's some native honeysuckle. And I want to point out, we're not really trying to remove the brush layer. We're trying to reduce the dominance of that tall brush, the way the honeysuckle and buckthorn tend to take over in the absence of fire. But the brush layer serves a purpose, and we just like to keep it down like this in the 3 to 4 foot height. And this particular patch gets burned through and top killed occasionally, and then it happily resprouts. I talked about mechanical removal. This is an example where after 2 fires, we've accomplished a pretty good reduction of your buckthorn canopy here. So there was no mechanical removal done at this site, and after just a couple of fires, we've really done a good job of reducing the interference that buckthorn is causing. So again, we like to do some mechanical cutting and get that thick buckthorn out of the way to accelerate the process, get some light down on the ground, get some air down there to really enable a better fire to get through and continue your control process. But it's something that fire alone eventually is going to have its effects. Herbaceous invasives. We see some garlic mustard here coming up. This is about 6 weeks after the fire. The garlic mustard is definitely not eradicated, but it's not causing much interference on anything either. So again, we've got it down as one of the elements of the ground layer that's not dominating everything and interfering with our other objectives. Some multiflora rose here that is just a small part of your ground layer vegetation. And here's some multiflora rose in the lower right and some Japanese hedge parsley on the left side. Again, with regular use of fire, these plants that otherwise might be interfering are just kind of taking their place along with all the other plants. Burdock is one that, as this grows up over the course of the season, that's going to provide some interference within that little patch of ground. But this is what we get on these old pastures. You see certain patches and areas that come back depending on how hard they were grazed and what the impacts were when the cattle were running through the woods. More or less these early succession weeds that tend to take over. But we also see that there's a lot of patchiness, and so we've got that patch of buckthorn, burdock on the right side, and we see some other patches that are kind of rough, but we also see patches that are filling in nicely with the ground layer vegetation that we like to see. As far as mechanical removal of trees, Eastern red cedar is one that normally we like to kind of thin out the cedar, get some more light on the ground, try to accelerate the process of getting fire through the area. But here's some cedars that have been exposed to, I believe it was 2 fires, and you can see they're pretty badly scarred. They're sensitive to the fire, and they're likely not going to be interfering for too much longer here. This one, that's not going to last much longer at all. And again, we can see here that this is a site where the landowners decided, well, maybe we do want to remove those cedars after all. And these 3 stumps show you that the cambium on those stumps is more than 75% dead around the circumference. These things have been hit pretty hard by just a couple of fires, and they wouldn't last long if you kept going with that fire regime. Here's an example of what you get with heavy fuel right up against the base of a tree. That's one of the things that if we're concerned with loss of timber value, we want to try to avoid getting heavy fuel piled up against the base of your oaks and the trees that you want to keep. In this case, this elm is one of the species that we'd like to remove to open up the mid-story some more and restore that oak woodland structure. So here's a good fire effect. Similar situation here. You can see the log that burned up and started the scar on this aspen. The pileated woodpeckers were pretty happy with this. They got some good meals out of that. And so we can see that with regular fire, we're starting to accomplish some of that canopy thinning and opening up that's really promoting that open oak woodland structure. Basswood is a shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive species. I talked about removing accumulated brush from the base of your trees that you want to keep. Conversely, we also will throw some brush in at the base of a tree that we really don't want to keep there. And so then you end up eventually with something like this. This bitternut hickory, this this tree was probably exposed to 2 or 3 fires over the past 10, 15 years, and you can see how sensitive it is that once it's scarred, that scar has really progressed, and that again, that's going to help us with opening up that structure. Similar situation with this birch. And here we can see how fire is really helping push back the edges and blur the transitions between the grassland and the woodland. You can see on the right all the top-killed brush, and we can see how the fire is starting to take out those birches, and you know, that's really going to open up the transition here and give you more of that that prairie, savanna, woodland structure that's more typical of historical conditions. This basswood was taking up a lot of sunlight in the canopy, and when that goes down, that opens up, that creates a big opening for oak regeneration, as well as more diversity in the ground layer. Of course, when you're opening up the canopy, you're also reducing some of that support that all that mid-story and closed canopy trees are providing for each other, so you're more susceptible to wind throw. In our area, we had a lot of soaking rain early this summer and a lot of high winds, and ended up with quite a bit of blowdown. But now that's opening things up again, opening up our structure and providing the opportunity for oak regeneration and continuation of the ecosystem. And talking about mechanical removal and having some patience, this is a view across the fence line at a neighboring property that's also being managed for oak woodland, but on a little less intensive time scale, so less mechanical removal and probably a little less often with the fire. And you can see that the structure is recovering, that you see a reduction in the mid-story and that tall brush layer from what we saw in our overgrown sites. And it's just progressing a little slower in than in the site where we had it on the accelerated path. Timber scarring, you're running fire through the woods, you're going to get some scarring, and I think Jack's going to address this a little bit. There's a certain amount of mortality that if fire didn't get it, insects would, or another tree falling on the base and causing a scar would. But timber scarring is a reality. It's probably not as serious as a lot make it out to be. but I can say that I caused some pretty good scars on trees before I got dialed in with keeping the fire intensity down. And you can definitely do some things that doesn't add a whole lot to your effort in the burn, to do dot ignition and try to use flanking fire and backing fire to move through your woods. This tree's got a little bit of scorch on the bottom of it, not too serious, but that's the kind of thing we like to avoid on these sites. As far as the ground layer, we can see pretty clearly, and we saw that in a lot of the other slides, that we're moving a lot of the biomass down from that mid-story, from that tall brush layer down to the ground, and that gives us a lot more diversity of species and gives us a habitat that a lot of plants and animals appreciate a lot more. So got pretty good floral resources in this shot to try to give the bumblebees something to eat. And of course, I like to take pictures of wildflowers when I see them in the woods, and as under a fire regime, when we're keeping that woods open and we've got some regular fire, the native wildflowers respond also. So that was really just a lot of show and tell, but I hope I was able to show how I've become convinced that really restoring fire to the landscape is going to help us reverse the problems that have come about by suppressing fire from the landscape. And clearly we can improve the structure. We can reduce the dominance of the mid-story and the brush layer and improve diversity of plants growing on the ground. And with that, I'm ready to take questions if we have time.
All right. Thank you, Jim, for that awesome presentation. So we'll switch to some Q&A to see what everybody has, and I'll go ahead and hit up the first question. So Jim, you talked about quite a bit in the webinar. The question here is, how does buckthorn respond to RX fire? How often do you need to burn, and is it the same for honeysuckle? You did show us pictures of buckthorn responding. Could you talk a little bit about the rotations that you would use, either in maintenance or if you're trying to get rid of buckthorn?
Well, we're in this restoration phase. We're burning much more often than I think you would, than I think historically the woods would have burned, and that you would burn when you get to a maintenance phase. To the direct question, buckthorn, when you've got 2 to 3 inch stems, it's going to take several burns to really top kill those tall canopy type buckthorn. Stems under an inch in diameter, you get really good top kill. We're going for 50 to 75% top kill of stems under an inch. And, in our objectives, we're going for, somewhere up to 50% of outright kill of the stems, half inch and under. And really, it's a repeated insult that if you're burning it every couple of years, you're not giving them a chance to recover, and keeping the those brush species down in the ground layer rather than being dominant in the mid-story.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question before we have to go to the next speaker. Let's go with the next question we have here. How big, DBH wise, diameter wise, how big do the stems need to be before you say, okay, instead of fire, we have to use something else?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't look at it in terms of size of stems, but really the canopy cover, the dominance. So, and thinking about buckthorn specifically, or honeysuckle, you get some of those thick stands where no light gets to the ground, nothing's growing. And if you can get some oak leaves down in there, that helps carry a fire. But that with that solid canopy, it takes longer for that fuel to dry out. It's harder to get a hot fire to go through. And so, we're really looking at trying to remove that solid canopy and get some light down to the ground.
So in summary, it's really more about thickness of the stand
I think
than
so.
thickness of the stems themselves.
And also you might not have to remove everything, but I've been working with creating swaths going through these brushy areas. So you get a swath opened up where you can get some fuel going and get some fire going in, and then gradually expand that area and reduce your brush areas.
Excellent, Jim. Thank you so much. We do have one or two more questions trickling in, but what we'll do is we'll hold them until the end of the second presentation, and that way we'll be able to handle them with both Jack and Jim answering. So at this time, I would like to introduce our next speaker by the name of Jack McGowan-Stinski, and Jack will be presenting on specific case studies and general information regarding interfering vegetation. Jack is not the founder. Jack is the current lead for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. Jack, go ahead, take it away.
All right, just want to make sure my slide's up. Into
You got it.
You can hear me? All right, we'll go forward then. So yeah, we'll talk about or continue on Jim's talk with prescribed fire and interfering vegetation. And of course it's froze. There we go. So just a quick snapshot, 30 plus years of dabbling in fire, a lot with the Nature Conservancy, instructor and cadre with lots of different courses, worked a little bit as consultant contractor, a variety of different seasonal positions. Do have my bachelor's from Stevens Point and master's from Central Michigan. Lots of prescribed fire and wildfire, and like Michelle said, program manager for Lake States Fire Science Consortium since 2013. All right, so just a reference, Joint Fire Science Program, if you haven't heard of the Fire Science Exchanges. Joint Fire Science Program hosts these. There are 15 Fire Science Consortia exchanges across the U.S., so you can always find one no matter where you go. And my background is across the Midwest and dabbled in a lot of prescribed fire in pine systems, as you can see, barrens all the way to forest, oak systems, prairies, wetlands, so pretty diverse background. And just to point out a lot of information we're going to talk about, this is coming off a variety of different monitoring and research. So a variety of different fuel loading for fire specifically, course level metrics, a lot of different plots, vegetation transects, floristic quality assessments, photo monitoring, rare butterfly surveys. A lot of the research was with grad students and so on. And for reference, this is based off of quite a few burns across multiple seasons, basically the whole year, as much as we could. And more so, and Jim mentioned it, repeat burns. A lot of information is coming from second, third, fourth, fifth entry burns. And that's where you start to really see the trends with fire. So that's kind of that frame. Two other kind of things I want to address, and we're kind of doing the 30,000 view here. I hammer on this time and again. When we're doing prescribed fire, our goal is not the flames, no matter how much we like to watch them. But again, what type of desired fire effects you're trying to achieve. And that's kind of where we can get into the interfering vegetation. Another thing to keep in mind, we're talking about fire and interfering vegetation, but Jim brought it up too. Fire is just one of the disturbance factors. There's a lot of different abiotic and biotic factors out there, and we kind of have to use fire among those other disturbance factors to assess, are we able to control interfering vegetation, or is interfering vegetation becoming a problem because of some of these disturbance factors? So what is interfering vegetation? Just get this up here. I mean, basically it's any type of plant species that complicates our restoration or management of fire-dependent systems. So that could be certainly non-native invasive plants. Jim mentioned a bunch of those, but also think about competitive native plants. And that depends. Even something like prairie grasses can be competitive at certain stages. So what is interfering kind of with the ultimate goal between burns too? And so just throwing out a variety of different invasives and competitive natives that I've dealt with. So you can see a variety of woodies, buckthorns, olives, multiflora rose, honeysuckles, tree of heaven, black locust, barberries, privets. And then you get more into the natives, so a bunch of mesophytes, certainly red maple, red cedar, hazelnut. Herbaceous invasives, you can read the list there: garlic mustard, bouncy bet, myrtle, spotted knapweed, phragmites, different cattails, canary grass. And then competitive natives, so bracken fern, Pennsylvania sedge, dominant prairie grasses, like I mentioned. And so for me, three main fire and plant species considerations come up, regardless if they're interfering, invasive, or native. So if we're focusing more on the invasive or competitive species, it's, what effects do fire have on those individual species? Does it harm them? Does it promote them? Then we can flip this around. What effects on the fuels and then the resulting fire behavior can those invasive species have? Do they pretty much eliminate the fuel, or do they become a fuel themselves and actually change the fire behavior? And then fire operations can also spread invasive species, but we're not going to dive into that on this talk. So if we kind of divide those two, again, the effects of fire and invasive species and competitive species, does it increase those? So in this case, the red arrow up might be that it promotes those invasive or competitive species. But if that's the interfering vegetation, we don't want it. It's a red, it's a stop sign. Versus if it's green and a down arrow, that means we're able to use fire and other techniques with fire to kind of reduce or stop the interfering vegetation. And then the same applies if we're talking about the fuels. Are they increasing or changing the fuel, or are they decreasing the fuel load, and therefore it makes it harder to use fire to deal with some of the interfering vegetation. So some basic effects of fire and invasive species, competitive species, just kind of breaking it down into four parts. Directly kills or shortly after. Indirect, is it stressing the individuals? And is there some other injury or mortality that you are manipulating through another tool? Or is it coming from some other abiotic or biotic disturbance that you've set up? Is it active competition with native species that are positively influenced by fire? Can you promote those native species that are fire dependent in the sense that they're actively competing now with the interfering plant species? And then the effects on allelopathic chemicals present in soil. So it could be allelopathic chemicals from bracken fern or from knapweed or others. And so for me too, it's also where are we at in the density or continuity or ground cover of these interfering vegetation, and where do we reach a tipping point where they drastically either alter the fuel or where they're so dense that you cannot generate enough heat from the fire to impact them negatively. So also, and Jim references, let's not forget our fire regime factors. So thinking about timing, and for me, timing is both frequency and season. So really thinking through different seasons. And then the spatial, what size and pattern are we using? And then intensity and severity kind of combinations. So if we wrap that up in those fire regime factors, we get an ecosystem response. Here's an example where, there's various lethal temperatures for different species. And another way to look at it, at least for me, is thinking about, whether it's damage to a species or not. That's going to depend on the moisture content and the physiological state throughout the year. And every species is going to have a different kind of threshold. So if we're looking at this, for instance, the thermometers, basically, the green might be where we want to generate that heat because we're getting a positive response. That's part of that disturbance factor. And the red is where we've kind of reached that lethal temperature, either causing injury or mortality. But different species are going to have different physiological stages or adaptations to fire to where we either can not use the heat against them or actively use it for native species. So it's kind of thinking about heat per unit area at the correct time on the species. And also thinking about this, I mean, if we go back here and look at lethal temperatures, it's not as if fire immediately reaches these lethal temperatures. You know, there's a time lag. So what is that time lag? And Jim talked about residence time as an example of that. And so again, looking at different species and heat effects, you know, we could lump our intensity and severity into different classifications. So, you know, we can have the high intensity, high severity, or we can have a high intensity, low severity, low intensity, high severity, low intensity, low severity. And it's trying to kind of parcel those out as we're going through. And then for me, a big thing is looking at what the phenology is and what the physiology is for these species. So we can remove that. You know, we have our dormancy, our senescence, you know, our growing seasons made up of, you know, our spring and growing season, leaf out, flowering, fruiting. And that doesn't happen all at once now, does it? So it's spread throughout, and we have different species that are already flowering, fruiting before many others have even started to either grow, leaf out, so on. So this growing season encompasses a large area of time. And so it's kind of finding where those kind of thresholds are in between, where you're talking breaking dormancy when you're actually into the growing season, and are you in early growing season, mid growing season, late growing season, when are you moving into true senescence? And again, you know, the calendar dates don't really do it justice. We have to use it in a lot of the states, but we know that depending where we are in the state or different states, where we are in geography, these months, these dates can change. So using something like growing degree days or phenological cues from specific species can help us determine when we might be getting the best effect from using fire and other techniques to put the hurt on the interfering vegetation that we want. Keep in mind also, we're dealing with live fuel moisture and soil moisture as we go through the growing season, you know, and how does that affect our duff and soil moisture changes? And that's going to have direct effect on our fuels and our intensity and severity that we get. You know, typically as we go through the growing season, you know, we're losing our duff and soil moisture, so drier conditions. And again, that's going to affect how that fire affects those plants. So as we're going through, what are the physiological stages where plants are more or less susceptible to fire? You know, in the vegetative stage, they might be somewhat, but certainly when they're flowering or fruiting, they're going to be more susceptible. And that doesn't necessarily mean you always wipe them out, but you're putting the hurt on them and allowing that native competition too. If we look at this at a bigger scale from trees, and we'll dive just barely into pines here, kind of three things to keep in mind. You know, are you generating enough heat downward, basically, in the litter and duff that you're actually causing some type of root injury or death? Are you generating enough heat on the bowl, basically, and charring? And that depends on the thickness of the bark. And are you causing any stress, injury, or damage? And obviously, it's going to depend also on the age of that individual and how intense and how severe that fire is. And then scorch and bud kill or bud survival is going to depend a lot on that crown base height and the bulk density of the other vegetation around it, and how much impact you're going to have from that fire. Or can you use the fire basically to promote pine species or oak species, but get rid of the interfering vegetation, because, you know, certain species have more fire adaptations to different heat output. But we also got to be aware too, if we put fire in at the wrong time of the year, or we have a heavy fuel loading, or we put a fire in that they typically are not adapted to, and we hit their roots, hit their bowl, hit the canopy, or we hit two or all three at once, we shouldn't be surprised then if we see injury on what we call so-called fire-dependent species. You know, they're only fire-dependent species if they, fire-dependent individuals, if they've actually been exposed to fire for a while and survived it. So kind of lumping all that together, here's an example where, looking at timing and season and thinking about, lumping this into warm season grasses. If you're burning more in that spring season, you're promoting the warm season grasses. You're inhibiting the cool season grasses. And again, you're not necessarily killing them outright. It's just more which ones are favored. If we move more into that growing season burn, you're going to favor the cool season and you're going to start to impact the warm season. And it gets even more critical when we look at forbs, for instance. So if we're constantly burning in the spring, we're really hurting the early flowering and the mid-flowering forbs, but we're promoting the late flowering forbs. And if we start to balance out different seasons of burn, you can see how we can be favoring a much more diverse part of the native vegetation. If we flip that onto our invasive species, non-native or competitive species, you can see if you're burning more in that spring season, you're just creating a disturbance that these species can capitalize on. They love it. And it doesn't matter if they're non-native invasives or if they're competitive species. Versus if you start to move into the growing season burning, you're at a physiological stage or these plants are at a physiological stage where you can start to negatively impact them with fire. And again, this isn't, don't switch and say, oh, we got to burn everything now in the growing season. It's a silver bullet. It's not. It's more emphasizing that opening the burn window, you're going to have different effects on different species. Sometimes positive effects on species you don't want to have a positive effect. Sometimes negative impacts on those species, whether they're interfering or not. And so lumping this together, for example, if we look at cool season grass phenology, and if you're burning and getting different effects, and for instance, let's say if the cool season grass is in your area, if pollination's occurring and you're burning during that time, you're promoting, it's a good time for promoting pine species. Warm season grasses do okay there. They may actually dominate, but this is also at that time where you can start to reduce them if they're interfering. Okay, and as we move through this, you can start to reduce them. And it really can set back bracken ferning, for example. And I can come back to the slide, but I have other specific examples. All right, so let's dive into kind of some oak and pine barren savanna sites and just see how this works. And I use these symbols up here, for instance, with the butterfly, birds, snakes, turtles. And so every species has certain habitat requirements so that they may be fire dependent animal species. They're not walking around with fire shelters. They're not walking around with fire extinguishers, right? They are fire dependent animal species because they live in habitats and fire promotes their needs. Basically, it provides the structure, their house, their food, and the circle around is what type of space do they need to kind of have all the requirements they need throughout all their life stages. They can't just sit in one small area, basically. And so interfering vegetation for this, if you're trying to promote it for a variety of rare species, interfering vegetation to these oak systems and oak and pine systems, spotted knapweed, St. John's wort, clovers, soapwort, leafy spurge, pen sedge, garlic mustard, bracken fern, red maple. You can add a bunch more here, but we'll go through it here. We certainly have quite a variety of different rare species we can look at. Forbs, and if you guys are looking close, you'll see, Carner blue is also nectaring on some of these. And there is fire behind this lupin, so burning when we're actually there. Variety of different animal species, and we'll include different game species, deer and turkey, rare butterflies, rare snakes, rare turtles. So if we single in on the Carner blue butterfly, for instance, we want to minimize impact to these individuals of these. But again, if you look at that, they're always on the landscape. We have eggs, larvae, and adult butterflies. It's not like they pack up in the winter and head down to Florida or something, right? They're always on the landscape. So part of it was teasing out when might be how do we burn to minimize impact on the eggs, the larvae, or the adult butterflies? The adult butterfly is the most mobile. They're also the egg layers. They're laying that next generation. And what kind of became key, we know lupin is the host plant for cardinal blue butterfly. Lupin is not a plant that has problems. It does well, in my experience, with almost any kind of disturbance or putting with plant plugs. It does well with fire. But what became critical is if knapweed was out competing most of the other forbs, and yes, cardinal blue will nectar on it, but it's those mid and late flowering forbs that kind of became key because the cardinal blue butterfly, when the adult, the egg-laying machine basically, if they can nectar, they can live more days. And the female can only lay so many eggs per day, but if she lives for more days, she's laying that many more eggs. And that becomes critical for getting that next generation. So it was really looking at what is the interfering vegetation, reducing the knapweed, but promoting the forb species. And this is looking at a single species, but it also, everything we were doing affected or helped a lot of these other rare species, whether they're plant or animal. So wrapping that all up in a lot of different burns, breaking up, the canopy, promoting basically the cardinal blue habitat for other species through all different seasons. And so if we dive into kind of some of this, so knapweed, for instance, you can control with fire. A lot of studies will say fire increases knapweed. If you dive into those research studies, they're based on fires with 1 or 2 burns where they burn where there's already knapweed present. Well, if you disturb knapweed and it's already present in the seed bank, it's going to be happy as can be. Of course, it's going to increase. But if you're trying to use fire where there is knapweed, and again, if you think back to that table I showed, if you're doing that in the spring, you're promoting it. So you would need to then use other techniques to reduce the knapweed. Could be chemical, mechanical, you name it. If you're also using fire, though, to try to set back the knapweed or actually eradicate it, you get into these late spring or actually summer burns are the best. But keep in mind, this increase in density of knapweed also decreases the fuel loads. Knapweed itself is not a good fuel for fire, just doesn't generate enough heat. And what we found basically is, if you get above greater than 20 rosettes per square meter, you're going to need other tools first to basically grow your native fuels, especially the prairie grasses, to then be able to generate enough heat from fire to negatively impact the knapweed. And what we're also seeing is that the knapweed has the allelopathic chemical called catechin, but that heat generated from the fires can help to volatilize that chemical from the soil. And throw this up, this is always a fun one. Consider alternative uses of fire. Where it was so dense, we still use fire with propane torches here. Or you could use it off a backpack. And so it's kind of an alternative use of that heat output to directly kill or injure. Here's an example with garlic mustard. So after doing dormant season burns, the garlic mustard patches, the dense ones are highlighted. We also had lower risk because we had already just done a burn, so we could go in there with propane torches and burn out those dense patches of garlic mustard at the time when the physiological stage where they could not tolerate that heat. Penn sedge, for instance, variety of studies, and then applying what we learned from different plots. Get it up here. So Penn sedge, can often form a dense vegetative mat that can really alter your fuel load and can inhibit other species growth, but that fire broadcast, prescribed fire in the growing season can really reduce that. If you burn in the dormant season, you just help that Penn sedge out. So if you're switching to different seasons, you're hitting the Penn sedge when it's at a stage where it's negatively impacted by that heat output. Removing red maple competition, I like to show this. The slide, for instance, so we were able to do both a heading fire over enough area and a backing fire. Most people look at the heading fire, and this was the same burn, same day, so on same unit, and they think, oh, this looks much more responsive, but look at that bracken fern response. There's less stems of red maple, but that's because the heading fire had enough intensity to basically eat through those little stems of the red maple and drop them. But all it did was top kill them because the heat was so fast. it did not generate down, versus the backing fire really put a hurt on the bracken fern and the red maple. You see a lot of the stems here of the young red maple because the heat did not chew through the stem, but it generated enough heat. And I'll get to the next picture here. That's what it looked like. It's really hard to see. Literally flame lengths in inches, but a long residence time, enough time to get that heat build up around that root collar, versus the heading fire, basically just top killed and resprouted. So again, it's really applying, thinking about, are we generating enough heat for red maple, for instance, or bracken fern around that root collar to where we're causing total kill? And that was the case. And this is all part of the restoring an oak barren system. Well, the oaks have a much higher tolerance to that heat. Even that long residence heat was not at the stage here where we hurt the oaks. And if anything, we help the oaks. We reduce the maples, and we reduce that heavy leaf litter pack there. So they survived the fire. We also expose a lot of mineral soil for turtles and so on, pollinators, everything else. And again, I mentioned the bracken fern, and this really, if you burn in the dormant season, you're favoring the bracken fern. If you can shift your burning later on when the bracken fern is up, and basically midsummer, you can start to impact that. And you're not only harming the adults or direct kill, but you're also starting to deal with that allelopathic chemical that bracken fern promotes or has. So just an example here where this was at one point really heavily impacted with bracken fern. You know, the first burn was growing season. It was a low intensity, low severity burn. Second burn was also growing season. It was about a moderate intensity because we had actually started to grow more fuel, so to speak, by removing some of the bracken fern in the first burn. There was more space for especially the grasses and forbs. That led to a more moderate intensity fire. It still was low severity, but we pretty much took out the bracken fern as an issue. Now, we didn't wipe it out entirely. It is a native species, but it was at a low level at that point. It wasn't interfering vegetation. All right, so let's, in the last few minutes, kind of just switch this and talk about pines, for instance. Pine and oak dominated, but more pine dominated. And for example, like with red pine, jack pine, we might have interfering vegetation that's hazelnut and maple. And keep in mind, the pines itself, from lack of fire, can also be the interfering vegetation because of the denser needle duff, the denser stands that pine plantations are often growing under, and the lack of fire. So again, keep in mind this, you know, if you enter with a fire and it's too intense or too severe or both, and you're kind of hitting or overcoming these adaptations of the roots, the bolls, and the crown, well, you're actually killing the species you're trying to promote. So again, it's thinking about the heat output at the time of year. So if we look at jack pine, I still hear a kind of a common misconception of jack pine, you know, that has to be a stand replacing fire, and it doesn't. You can do fire in the growing season. You're still generating enough heat to release the serotinous cones, the seeds from the serotinous cones. But you can keep your fire at a stage where you're not killing all, even the young jack pine, and you can actually start getting a multi-age jack pine stands with good understory too. And you can see, you know, from repeated low intensity burns, we're actually doing fire pruning of those limbs. We're raising that crown base height. The more we raise the crown base height, the less likely any of those jack pine or red pine are going to be even susceptible to the next fire if we can keep it lower intensity. And here's just a more dramatic example where a denser stand jack pine deciding, all right, we're going to have good jack pine recruitment, but if this young jack pine here continues, we're basically on the route to have a crown fire, a complete stand replacing fire. But by multiple low intensity burns, we were able to raise that canopy base height of the adults. Also got really good young jack pine regeneration, but opened that up, got a lot, much more herbaceous layer underneath here. And this happened to be in Kirtland's warble area also, so you're promoting for that rare species. From the red pine perspective, you can see these are both growing season burns in red pine. Just some examples, from one site. The first burn was a low intensity, low severity. It was dormant season. And you can see that the second burn, moderate intensity, low severity. The moderate intensity, again, is because we were able to start growing more fuel, so to speak. And the third burn was a growing season burn, low intensity, moderate severity. And that sequence there and then moving to growing season really was able to take out a lot of the hazel. So these two, hazel is one of the big interfering, hazelnut, excuse me, is one of the big interfering vegetation, as well as bracken fern and red maple. And the dormant season burns top killed them. This growing season burn is the one that was at the right physiological stage, and we had enough fuel, so to speak, from these other two burns to where we were able to generate enough heat and have total kill of the hazelnut, the bracken fern, and the red maple. And it did not harm the pines in that. And so this last one of the last slides here really packed full of information, for instance. But again, there's concern with burning in red pine. Well, you can see the bole char in red pine total average sloughs off after so many years between burns, basically. The height is really low. That's actually the stumpage height. Most of the char is going to be on the stumpage that's not going to be cut. If we look at our burn temperatures here, first burn, second burn entries, or first burn temp and second entry temp, a foot above ground or a half foot above ground, a lot more needle duff here, and trying not to impact the roots, but we are getting close to that temperature where we could cause root injury or mortality. By that second entry burn, we were able to basically, through repeated burns, slough off enough of that needle duff through repeated burns, and that obviously reduced our temperature because there's less fuel to generate the heat, which made it even less likely we're going to have any root damage or mortality. You can see the combined litter and duff depth reduced down to where we pretty much eliminated a lot of the needle duff, got a lot more exposure of the soil, got a lot more of the herbaceous back, and hazelnut became a part of the system, not an interfering vegetation. Back to the char here, you can see, the thickness of the char through that bark. There's hardly any char, really. Again, that's sloughed off. That doesn't become part of that timber quality. And burn mortality is often a big question. Jim brought this up, and red pine example here is this is average burn mortality. This is over 20 different sites with 2 or 3 burns each, 2.6% mortality on red pine. It's not additive. This is the average. This is the total. And if you start looking at, again, other abiotic and biotic disturbance factors, that is a much less mortality than what you can get from wind throw and so on. So it's not an additive from the burns. There seems to be a certain, at least from a lot of these sites in the monitoring, a certain level of mortality or injury that's going to occur no matter what. It's going to come from insects, wind throw, so on. And the fire or repeated fires were not additive to that mortality rate. And just this is one of the most dramatic, but example here where before there was any burnings, plot in 2004 versus after 3 burns in 2019, no surprise, but it was really wonderful to see blueberries exploding, basically. So hazelnut pretty much not interfering anymore, just a part of the system. Bracken fern not being interfering, and blueberries and other berry producing crops just exploded. And that's what I got. Michelle? Okay.
I'm here. All right. Thank you so much, Jack. Great presentation. So we'll switch to the Q&A and see if there's any questions that have come in. We did have a question that was left over from the first presentation that I think both of y'all could certainly provide some help on. Could you speak at all about beech's response to your fires and advice on handling beech taking over the mid-story? Also, what fire frequencies are you applying?
Well, I can say I don't get into beech very much. My understanding is it's pretty fire sensitive, but I I don't really have any experience with beech.
Yeah, it is fire sensitive. It's one of the mesophytic species. So I'm trying to unwrap the question. What was the question again?
Can you speak at all about beech's response to fire and advise on how to handle beech taking over your mid-story?
Okay. So yeah, beech is fire sensitive, but it's one of those cases where depending on how much beech there is or other mesophytic species, it changes the fuel load because beech leaves or other mesophytic species, the leaves don't burn as easily. They're dry, but they're flat. You know, it's a denser fuel bed versus like oak hickory has that nice fluff and a lot of aeration and can burn intense. So you can get fire in there, but you might have to be, again, it's the patience thing. It's going to take repeated burns. Um, you might have to be ready to go back in and relight patches and so on, and or go in and can you do some type of mechanical thinning or a drill and fill with herbicide to break up that beech dominance, you know, allow some other fuels basically to build up. I don't know if that answered or not, but it's depends where you are on that scale of how much beech or other tree species and what it's done to the fuel loading.
It all depends is an answer we've heard before, and it is totally suitable. Yes. All right. I don't see any more questions coming in, but I would like to pose my own to see if it ticks anyone's thinking. You know, with the concerns about climate change and shifts in species presence across the country, and especially more northern shifts as temperatures rise. What do y'all foresee is one of the emerging interfering vegetation species that we'll have to deal with in Wisconsin?
Jim, I think it's gonna be a lot of the same. I I actually don't know like new invasives that are coming in. There are, but I don't know how they're impacting kind of that oak hickory or pine stands. Man, but there is a change in what we're seeing with season. Like, are we going to be trending towards more wetter springs? You know, which might make it harder to do the dormant season burning in the spring to meet certain objectives. Are we being forced to shift to different seasons, not because of the effects, but because of climate change overall?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great point. Coming up from Kansas prior to Wisconsin, my suspicious eye is on eastern red cedar rearing its head more, but that's my background.
Yeah, and Jim
Okay.
brought that up with the red cedar, and you know,
Yep.
you can kill that with fire. So
So we have one final question, I think, before we'll have to wrap it up. So the question is, here in northern Michigan, red or pin oak can dominate pine barren restorations. What season, intensity, and frequency would you think is most effective in reducing oak while preserving the pine?
wow, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I should have left my talk up and go back to that using the cool season grass phenology on that. But again, it's going to be more in the growing season or later growing season, my experience, where you can actually harm the oaks. It has everything to do with the duff moisture and soil moisture is dropping out at that point, so that you don't the heat output you have is going to ideally override a lot of those physiological or fire adaptations that you have with oak. Plus, you know, if you burn during the growing season, depending on how dense the oak are, you're not only like generating heat from the litter and duff, you're impacting it through the bark because it's a long residence time. So you're raising that heat through the bark, and you have live canopy. So you're starting to actually scorch. You can scorch the oak leaves actually. So you're kind of overriding some of the adaptations of oak by shifting into that season. So, and these are going to be made available so we can look at that cool season grass phenology. And that cool season grass phenology was developed in northern Michigan at sites. So that will help with that question for that person.
Sounds like a really applicable slide. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, I do not see any more questions coming in. So what I am going to do is at this point, we'll go to the closeout And I swear I'm going to share the right screen here. Okay, great. So before we close out, I did wanted to do a small shout out to the prescribed fire dashboard that we have as part of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. If you would like to see more information on DNR prescribed burns, we have the website right here at dnrmaps.we.gov/prescribed burn dashboard. Or if you can't remember all that, you can just Google Wisconsin prescribed fire dashboard and it'll be one of the first hits. So it'll tell you a little bit more about when, where, and why we're burning. And you can go back all the way down, all the way to 2019 and view our information as well as export it for yourself. So had to make a plug. All right, well, this wraps up today's webinar. Thank you all so much for attending. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today, but we did want to thank Jack and Jim for sharing their experience and expertise with us. Please take a moment to evaluate today's session so we can improve the series. You can scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the chat. The evaluation link will be posted as well in the portal. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in October 2nd when we explore prescribed fire workforce development. Thanks and have a great day.